On the afternoon of the 16th of March, 1914, a woman entered the offices of one of the most powerful newspapers in France and asked to see the editor. She was shown inside. The door closed behind her. When the door opened again, Gaston Calmette was on the floor, and the woman who had shot him 6 times was standing with the pistol still in her hand. She did not attempt to run. She had nothing to say in the immediate moment that she had not already decided. It was the early spring of 1914 in the city of Paris, capital of the French Third Republic. The season had brought cold, pale light to the broad boulevards and the narrow streets behind them, and the cafes along the Rue de Rivoli were filled each morning with men reading newspapers over their coffee, debating the affairs of the government with the intensity of those for whom political life was a matter of personal honor and daily consequence. The press was, in those years, the principal instrument of public discourse in France, not merely a means of reporting events, but a weapon, wielded with precision and without scruple by those who possessed the editorial power to do so. A newspaper of sufficient circulation could elevate a minister or destroy one, could expose a private life and lay it before the public for judgment, and could do so within the protections afforded by the press laws of the Republic, with very little recourse available to those who found themselves its subjects. Into this world had stepped, by the virtue of her marriage, a woman named Henriette Caillaux. She was the wife of Joseph Caillaux, the former Prime Minister of France, a man of considerable influence and equally considerable enemies. She was intelligent, composed in her manner, and by the early weeks of 1914, under a pressure of a kind that she had concluded could not be resolved by legal means alone. What she resolved to do instead would become one of the most debated acts in the history of the French courts. Henriette Renoir had been born in 1874 into a family of modest but respectable Parisian standing. Her early life followed the course common to women of the French bourgeoisie in that era: an education sufficient for social accomplishment, an expectation of marriage, and a domestic existence within a household of some means. The details of her first marriage are not fully preserved in the historical record. It is her second union that brought her into public consequence. Joseph Caillaux was, by the time of their marriage in 1911, already a figure of national prominence. He had served as Minister of Finance on multiple occasions, was an advocate of progressive income taxation, a matter of fierce political controversy in the France of that period, and had pursued a foreign policy notable for its pragmatism and its willingness to negotiate with Germany during the Agadir crisis of 1911. These positions had earned him the devotion of some and the unremitting hostility of others. In the volatile political atmosphere of pre-war France, where nationalist sentiment ran high and suspicion of German intentions had become a matter of public passion, a man who counseled restraint and diplomacy was not without his enemies in the press. Henriette had become involved with Joseph Caillaux some years before their marriage, during the period when he was still wed to his first wife. The relationship had been conducted with discretion, though not in absolute concealment. The correspondence that had passed between them during those years, affectionate letters, written with the expectation of privacy, existed, and those who wished to damage Joseph Caillaux were aware of their existence. From late 1913 onward, the newspaper Le Figaro, under the editorship of Gaston Calmette, mounted a sustained and deliberate campaign against Joseph Caillaux. The attacks were not confined to his political positions. They extended to his personal conduct, to his character, and to the private history of his marriage. On the 13th of January 1914, Le Figaro published one of the private letters, a letter written by Joseph Caillaux to Henriette during their earlier years together, when he was still the husband of another woman. The letter was affectionate. Its publication was intentional. The design was transparent, to expose Joseph Caillaux as a man who had maintained a public posture of respectability while conducting himself otherwise, and to expose Henriette to the judgment of a public that had not asked to read her private correspondence. By morning, the letter was in every household that took Le Figaro. Nothing, from that day forward, was the same. Henriette Caillaux understood the implications of the publication with immediate clarity. The letter was a beginning, not a conclusion. Calmette held further correspondence. The campaign had been proceeding for months without pause, and had shown no sign of restraint. Joseph Caillaux, Constrained by his position in public life and by the legal realities of press law in the Republic, had limited recourse. Defamation proceedings were possible in theory. In practice, they were slow, uncertain, and guaranteed to sustain rather than diminish the public attention directed at the matter. The press laws of the Third Republic extended considerable protection to newspapers in the publication of material concerning public figures, and the nature of what had been published, a genuine private letter, not a fabricated document, complicated any legal challenge further. She consulted with her husband regarding what might be done. He could offer little that was satisfactory. He continued his political activities with the composure of a man experienced in public controversy. But the campaign was, by February of 1914, a daily occurrence. Each edition of Le Figaro brought fresh material. The language used to describe Joseph Caillaux moved between the political and the personal without hesitation. Henriette was not spared. Her prior relationship with Joseph, the years before the divorce, the letters, the circumstance of their marriage, was presented for public consumption as evidence of the moral character of both. By the first weeks of March 1914, Henriette Caillaux had formed a resolve. It is not possible, from the surviving record, to determine precisely when that resolve hardened into intention. What is documented is the sequence of actions that followed. On the 14th of March, she went to a gunsmith in Paris and purchased a Browning semi-automatic pistol. She also purchased ammunition. She took a limited degree of instruction in the weapon's use. She did not inform her husband. She did not seek legal counsel regarding what she intended. She proceeded alone and in silence. On the morning of the 16th of March, she gave no indication of what she had determined. The day progressed by ordinary measure. The household continued its routine. The newspapers arrived. Le Figaro was among them. By afternoon, Henriette had dressed and gone out. She carried a handbag. Inside the handbag was the loaded pistol. She traveled by automobile to the offices of Le Figaro, situated on the Rue Drouot in the 9th arrondissement of Paris. She arrived shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening. Nothing more was thought of it in the house she had left behind. She gave her name at the entrance of the offices. The staff of Le Figaro, who knew the name well, were aware of the significance of her arrival. Word was carried upstairs to Gaston Calmette. He agreed to receive her. She was escorted to his private office on the upper floor. The door was closed. No other person was present in the room. What passed between them in the minutes that followed was never established with certainty. No independent witness heard the exchange. Henriette Caillaux's subsequent account described a brief conversation, the presentation of her demands that the campaign cease, and a response from Calmette that she characterized as dismissive. Other reconstructions of events, based on the physical evidence and the time elapsed between her entry into the office and the sound of shots, suggested an interval too brief for any extended negotiation. What is established without dispute is that Henriette Caillaux removed the pistol from her handbag and fired. She fired 6 shots. Gaston Calmette was struck by all 6. He fell to the floor of his office. Members of the editorial staff, hearing the reports, entered the room. They found Calmette on the floor and Henriette Caillaux standing with the pistol still in her possession. She made no attempt to depart. She surrendered the weapon without resistance. She stated in the immediate aftermath, and in the presence of those who had entered the room, that she had come to put an end to the campaign against her husband, and that she had acted from a moment of overwhelming feeling. Gaston Calmette was conveyed with urgency to a nearby hospital. Surgeons attended to his injuries without delay. 6 bullets had entered his body. Several had reached vital organs. He was operated upon through the night. He died later that same evening. Henriette Caillaux was taken from the offices of Le Figaro by the Paris police and formally placed under arrest. She was charged with murder. Joseph Caillaux, informed of the shooting in the course of that evening, withdrew immediately from his political duties, resigned from his position in the Senate, and engaged legal counsel on his wife's behalf. By the morning of the 17th of March, the case dominated the front pages of every major newspaper in France. The city, which had followed the campaign against Joseph Caillaux for months, now confronted something it had not anticipated. The investigation was placed in the hands of the examining magistrate assigned to the case. Henriette Caillot was committed to the Saint-Lazare prison to await trial. The post-mortem examination of Gaston Calmette was conducted by the appointed physicians in Paris in the days following his death. The findings confirmed that 6 bullet wounds had been sustained, consistent with shots fired from close range in rapid succession. Several of the wounds had penetrated vital organs, and the combined effect of the injuries was determined to be the direct and immediate cause of death. No finding in the post-mortem record was disputed by either the prosecution or the defense. The act itself, the shooting, was not a matter the court was called upon to establish. It had been witnessed. It had been admitted. The question before the court was one of legal classification, and the legal classification turned upon the question of intent. The pistol recovered from Henriette Caillot was examined. It was a Browning semi-automatic weapon, purchased by the defendant on the 14th of March 1914, from a licensed gunsmith in Paris. The transaction was documented. The accompanying purchase of ammunition was similarly recorded. Evidence was introduced that Henriette Caillot had, between the 14th and the 16th, made some enquiry into the use of the weapon, though the extent of any instruction received was limited, and the matter was not resolved with precision in the investigation. What was established without question was that the pistol had been loaded before she entered the offices of Le Figaro, that she had carried it in concealment, and that she had fired it with effect. The investigation examined Henriette Caillot's movements in the days preceding the 16th of March. Her correspondence was reviewed. Her conversations, as reported by members of the household, were entered into the record. She had not, by the account of those around her, given overt indication of her intentions. She had discussed with Joseph Caillot the continued publication of private letters and the inadequacy of legal remedies. She had expressed distress and determination. No witness could state that she had disclosed a specific plan. The examining magistrate conducted multiple interrogations of the defendant at Saint-Lazare. She maintained throughout that she had not arrived at the offices of Le Figaro with the purpose of killing Gaston Calmette, that she had intended to confront him and to demand cessation of the campaign, and that the firing of the weapon had been the consequence of a moment of emotional extremity rather than deliberate resolution. 1914, and to the trial that would follow. The trial of Henriette Caillot was set for July of 1914 before the Cour d'assises at the Palais de Justice in Paris. The lead counsel engaged for the defense was Fernand Laborie, one of the most celebrated advocates in France, whose previous career had included the defense of Alfred Dreyfus. Joseph Caillot contributed substantially to the preparation of the defense case. Henriette remained in custody at Saint-Lazare throughout the intervening months. The case attracted attention of a kind rarely accorded to criminal proceedings in France. Not merely journalistic interest, but political investment from every quarter of the Republic. The trial of Henriette Caillot commenced on the 20th of July, 1914, at the Cour d'assises of the Seine, within the Palais de Justice in the 1st arrondissement of Paris. The presiding judge oversaw proceedings conducted in an atmosphere unlike that of an ordinary criminal trial. The courtroom was filled to its full capacity at each session. Journalists occupied the galleries in numbers. Political figures attended as spectators. Outside the building, the public gathered in the streets to await the daily reports. The prosecution presented its case with methodical attention to the physical evidence. Henriette Caillot had purchased a weapon. She had loaded it. She had entered the offices of a newspaper carrying it concealed. She had fired it 6 times into the body of the editor, killing him. These facts, the prosecution argued, constituted an act of willful murder, deliberate, premeditated, and executed with lethal efficiency. The purchase of the weapon 2 days before the shooting, the acquisition of ammunition, and the act of loading the pistol before her entry into the building were presented as the steps of a planned act rather than the impulse of a distressed moment. Fernand Laborie, for the defense, constructed his case upon different foundations. He placed before the jury the history of the campaign conducted by Le Figaro against Joseph Caillot. He introduced into evidence the nature of what had been published and the further publications that had been threatened. He argued that Henriette Caillot had been subjected, through her husband's public exposure, to a form of sustained and deliberate personal destruction for which the law offered no adequate remedy. He invoked the doctrine of the crime passionnel, recognized in French criminal law and in the broader cultural understanding of the courts as a category of act in which overwhelming emotional compulsion, arising from circumstances of exceptional provocation, might mitigate or negate criminal intent. Expert witnesses in medicine testified regarding Henriette Caillou's state of health and nervous constitution in the period preceding the shooting. The trial lasted 8 days. Witnesses from the offices of Le Figaro gave varying accounts of the defendant's demeanor in the immediate aftermath. Political testimony regarding the conduct of the press raised questions that extended beyond the case itself. On the 28th of July, 1914, the jury retired. They deliberated for a period of just over an hour. They returned a verdict of not guilty. Henriette Caillou was acquitted on all charges. She received the verdict without visible expression. The courtroom was cleared. The verdict was delivered on the same day that the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war upon Serbia. Within a week, Germany had declared war upon France. The attention of a nation that had followed the trial of Henriette Caillou with something approaching collective obsession was turned, within a matter of days, toward a conflict that would consume it for 4 years and claim its young men in numbers that rendered the preoccupations of July 1914 almost incomprehensible in retrospect. The newspapers that had filled their front pages with testimony from the Palais de Justice turned those same pages to mobilization orders and communiques from the frontier. The case receded. It did not disappear. The reactions to the acquittal, in the brief interval before the war overtook them, followed the divisions that had characterized the trial itself. Those who had seen Henriette Caillou as a woman driven to an act of desperation by the deliberate and legally protected destruction of her husband's reputation received the verdict as a just conclusion. Those who viewed the shooting as a calculated act of political violence committed by a woman of means against a journalist who had published what he had the legal right to publish, condemned the outcome as a failure of the Republic's institutions to treat all persons equally before the law. Legal scholars observed that the verdict extended the crime passionnel doctrine in ways that several found troubling and others found entirely consistent with the established practice of the courts. Henriette Caillou was released from Saint-Lazare upon the delivery of the verdict. She and Joseph Caillou withdrew from public life for the duration of the war. Joseph Caillou's political career, already damaged by the months of press campaign and the circumstances of the trial, did not recover its former character. He returned to the Senate after the armistice, but the accusations that attached themselves to him, of defeatism during the war, of financial impropriety, pursued him through the post-war years. He was briefly imprisoned in 1920 on charges arising from alleged wartime communications with enemy agents, though he was subsequently released and his civil rights eventually restored. He died in 1944. Henriette Caillou died in 1943, in the relative obscurity to which she had withdrawn 3 decades before. The case endures in historical examination for reasons that transcend the shooting itself. It raised, in a form made vivid by public trial, questions about the power of the press to harm private persons through the publication of private material, about the limitations of legal remedy in such circumstances, and about the degree to which cultural and social norms regarding honor, gender, and family standing intersected with the application of criminal law. The fact that the trial coincided with the opening days of the First World War lends it a particular quality of historical suspension, as though the proceedings belonged to one era and the verdict to the brief, final hours of another. The question of whether justice was served in the matter of Gaston Calmette's death does not admit a definitive answer. It belongs, as such questions usually do, to the context of those who ask it and the values by which they ask. The file of the case remains in the records of the Palais de Justice, in the city of Paris, set down in the summer of 1914, while Europe was becoming something no one in that courtroom had yet understood. The Rue Drouot is still there, in the 9th arrondissement. The building that housed the offices of Le Figaro has changed over the century that has passed. The boulevard runs as it always did, past the cafes and the newsstands, in the direction of the boulevards beyond.